Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The access road branched off Forest Service Route 14 about 6 miles past the Ridger turnoff, and whoever had maintained it last had given up at least 2 seasons ago. I kept the truck in second gear and let the suspension take the punishment. Ruts ground to bedrock, drainage gullies nobody had graded since spring. The core vehicle was a white F250 with government plates and more prior damage than the odometer could explain. I wasn't worried about adding to it. 11 miles of that. Old-growth Douglas fir pressed in from both sides, the canopy heavy enough to kill what remained of the afternoon light. November in the Eastern Cascades. By 4 o'clock you're driving with headlights, and by 5 you're wondering if you missed a turn because nothing out here wants to be found. Harland Dam was one of those places. I'd pulled federal intake jobs from the Dalles to Grand Coulee, and every dam I'd worked sat on a major river with a road that justified its existence. Harland sat on a tributary most fishermen hadn't heard of, at the end of a Forest Service road most logging companies had abandoned. The project file listed it as a mid-capacity hydroelectric and flood control facility, Army Corps of Engineers, commissioned in 1961. Its power output was modest. Its location made no sense. About 3 miles before the dam, I passed a locked gravel spur climbing north through the timber. New chain-link gate, fresh federal signage. The warning identified the land beyond as restricted watershed infrastructure and cited statutes nobody driving a logging road should have had to think about. The gate looked newer than anything else on that mountain. I kept driving. $1,600 a day is $1,600 a day. I'm a commercial diver. Contract work. Army Corps of Engineers, 18 years. I clear intake tunnels, inspect underwater infrastructure, weld things that need welding at depths where welding becomes an act of faith. I'm good at it, and the federal day rate covers my daughter's tuition at Oregon State and the money I wire to my ex-wife every month without her asking. The rate for this job was nearly double the standard federal scale, and when the contracting office called me directly, outside the normal rotation and bid process, I said yes before they finished describing the site. I had worked restricted federal installations before, naval cooling intakes, reservoir structures near test ranges, one job outside Bremerton where the paperwork was thicker than the dive plan and nobody used the real name of the facility. I knew how to sign what needed signing and keep my report to the work performed. That kind of reputation follows a man. So does debt. I should have asked why the pay was so high. I should have asked why they were calling me specifically. But I had a tuition payment due in 9 days and a checking account that couldn't cover it. And the obvious answer was already there. Remote location, cold water, significant depth, federal urgency. I'd worked all of those before. I'd survived all of those before. That reasoning carried me the full 11 miles. The dam appeared through the trees in the last grey of daylight, a concrete face set into a narrow canyon, water staining its surface in dark vertical streaks. It wasn't large by Corps standards, maybe 200 feet across the crest, 80 feet high. The reservoir behind it was swollen with fall rain, the surface flat and colourless. Below the dam, the discharge channel cut through the canyon floor toward the river, but nothing was moving through it. The spillway gates were dry. The dam had been offline for 22 days. Kyle Mosher was waiting at the access platform above the intake shaft, sitting on an equipment case with a thermos and the look of a man who'd been cold for 2 days straight. He was 32, built like a distance runner, and he'd been working as my dive tender on and off for 4 years. Tending is the other half of commercial diving. Kyle managed my umbilical, monitored my air supply and comms, maintained my gear, and held my continued existence in his hands every time I went under. The arrangement worked because Kyle was precise where it mattered and quiet where it didn't. He stood when I pulled up, Shaft access took most of yesterday. The hatch bolts were corroded almost solid. Somebody had welded a secondary steel plate over the cover. Maintenance had to cut it off with a torch. When was the last time they put a diver in? They haven't. Loomis says they've never needed one in the intake system. The whole thing was built to run without human access. I looked at the hatch, a steel disc set into the concrete platform, the cut marks from Kyle's torch still bright on the rim. A dam designed so no one would ever need to go inside its intake tunnel. Now, after 60-some years, someone needed me inside badly enough to pay double rate. Kyle followed my look. I don't like that weld. Nobody welds a hatch shut because they trust the bolts. That's what I don't like. He'd spent the morning routing our surface lines through a lower maintenance gallery because Harland had never been fitted with a proper dive station. He'd had to make the old structure accept us. Air bottles staged where there was room, comms run past relay cabinets, the retrieval winch bolted to a platform that had probably last seen a fresh torque wrench before I was born. He had sketched the access levels on the back of a calibration sheet, more for himself than for me. Lower gallery, turbine hall, secondary cooling loop, service ladder, intake shaft. Kyle didn't like not knowing the way out of a place. I told myself that was the job. A facility that had never required a diver didn't have dive infrastructure, which meant Kyle had spent 2 days improvising. That justified the money. The weld, the road, the gate in the timber. All of it could fit under the same heading if I wanted it to. Federal urgency. The briefing was in the dam's control building, a low concrete block built into the canyon wall above the discharge channel. Inside, it resembled every other core facility I'd worked. Cable trays bolted to the ceiling, instrument panels from the Kennedy administration, old coffee burned into the smell of the walls. Hank Loomis, the dam's chief operator, had set up a folding table with site drawings and sensor printouts. He was in his 50s, with the creased complexion of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, and most of that time alone. He ran Harland Dam because someone had to, and because the pension was worth the isolation. Loomis walked me through the setup. The dam had a single intake tunnel, a horizontal concrete bore roughly 12 feet in diameter, running into the dam face at a depth of about 160 feet. Water entered the tunnel, passed through a primary intake grate designed to stop large rubble, then through a secondary screen, and into the turbine gallery beyond. 22 days ago, the sensors had flagged a major pressure drop across the primary grate. Something was blocking the tunnel. Sonar through the tunnel's curves returned poor imaging. They could see a large mass against the grate but couldn't resolve its composition. "What's your best guess?" I asked. "Storm damage," Loomis said. "We had high water in September. Timber comes down the canyon, root balls, sometimes vehicles off the forest roads above the reservoir. It compacts against the grate and you've got yourself a plug." "You've had blockages before?" Something moved in his expression, a tightening around the eyes that I took for territorial annoyance because that was the easiest thing to call it. His right hand flattened over a pressure graph on the table, covering a column of dates. "We run maintenance cycles," he said. "High-flow flushes. This is the first time the grate hasn't cleared on its own." He didn't mention the flushes again. "Dam operators have their procedures and their pride. You don't question how a man runs his facility if you want his cooperation getting in and out of the water." On the wall map behind him, the reservoir ended at a hard black boundary about 4 miles upstream. Beyond it, the watershed became a blank federal parcel, stripped of contour lines, service roads, and notation. When I asked if there were any upstream facilities that might have contributed rubble, Loomis looked at the map long enough for the pause to become its own answer. "Nothing that affects your dive," he said. The fourth man in the room was James Ward. He'd been introduced as a federal infrastructure liaison from the Corps Washington office, the kind of desk-level bureaucrat who shows up when a project crosses someone's budget threshold or scheduling deadline. He was mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing civilian clothes too pressed for a dam site, and boots that had never touched mud before today. He sat at the end of the table with a leather portfolio and an expression I couldn't read. Ward waited until Loomis finished, then asked me 2 questions. The first, will your helmet camera provide adequate visual documentation of the obstruction? The second, based on your experience, can you distinguish timber, sediment, animal matter, and synthetic material under low visibility conditions? I told him my helmet camera recorded standard definition and that I'd been identifying underwater rubble for 18 years. Both answers seemed to satisfy him, though what exactly they satisfied I couldn't say. Then he produced a supplementary non-disclosure agreement, a federal form heavier than the standard core NDA, with classification markings I'd seen before on jobs near military installations. He explained it as routine for federally sensitive infrastructure. I signed it. I'd signed similar documents at other federal sites, and the alternative was driving 11 miles back down that road without $1,600 a day. Kyle wasn't asked to sign anything in the room. When I noticed, Ward said Kyle's paperwork was being processed through a separate channel. I watched Loomis during that exchange. He was staring at the sensor printouts on the table, but he wasn't reading them. He was waiting for the paperwork conversation to end the way a man waits for a storm to pass his window. I suited up on the platform above the shaft as the last light bled out of the canyon. The rig was mine. A Kirby Morgan 37 helmet on a vulcanized rubber dry suit, weighted boots, harness, tool belt. Kyle ran the comms check, verified umbilical connections, and tested the primary and backup lights. The umbilical was 570 feet of reinforced hose carrying my air supply, comms wire, and a pneumatic service line for my tools. One end connected to my helmet. The other ran to the dive station where Kyle controlled the air mix, the retrieval winch, and the only voice I'd hear for the next several hours. He checked the bailout valve twice. Kyle did that only when he was worried. "Comms check," he said. "Loud and clear." "Primary light." I turned my head and swept the beam across the platform. "Backup." Chest lamp on. Narrower beam. Enough to get home if everything else stayed honest. Kyle leaned close enough that his voice carried outside the comms. "You feel anything off down there, you call it? I don't care what Washington is paying." Through the control room windows, I could see Ward standing behind the glass, watching the platform with his hands folded. Below him, visible through a second window, Loomis sat at the turbine control console with his palms resting flat on panels he'd been told not to touch. Kyle finished the check. "You're clear. Comms are good. I've got you." I stepped off the edge and dropped through the hatch into the shaft. The water took me. Cold hit first. Even through the suit. Even through the thermal liner, the temperature arrived as a full-body compression, squeezing inward from every side. Then came the dark. My helmet lights cut 2 white cones into water, the color of weak tea, and the shaft walls closed in tight around me. The intake shaft was a vertical concrete bore, maybe 8 feet across, dropping straight down into the dam's interior. Mineral deposits crusted the walls in rough layers, and decades of bacterial growth had darkened the concrete, slick under my gloves when I braced. I descended on the guide cable, controlling my rate, watching the depth gauge on my wrist tick upward. 60 feet. 80. 100. The water temperature dropped another degree, and I felt it in my fingers despite the gloves, a stiffening that would only get worse the longer I stayed down. At 160 feet, the shaft curved into the horizontal intake tunnel. The transition was a smooth concrete elbow, engineered to direct water without turbulence. I pulled myself around it and into the main bore. The tunnel opened to 12 feet in diameter, but with the bulk of my suit and the umbilical trailing behind me, the space felt less generous than the numbers suggested. A steel guide rail ran along the ceiling, bolted into the concrete every 6 feet or so. I gripped it and pulled myself forward, hand over hand. Kyle's voice came through the comms, clear and close. "Depth holding at 162, umbilical tension nominal. You're about 40 feet into the tunnel." I acknowledged and kept pulling. The rhythm was almost steadying. Reach, grip, haul, release. The only sound was my own breathing, each exhale a roar inside the helmet that 18 years of diving had never made quieter. The regulator fed air in a steady rush that filled the enclosed space with white noise between breaths. Behind me, the umbilical scraped against bolt heads and wall brackets, each contact arriving as a metallic tick through the water. My primary beam pushed about 4 feet ahead before the sediment-heavy water killed it. Beyond that edge, nothing existed until I hauled myself there. A minor current drew toward the grate. With the turbines offline, it was a slow pull, like standing in a corridor with a vent drawing air at the far wall. Enough to notice. Manageable. I counted rail bolts, old habit from tunnel work. Each bolt was a known distance, and counting them kept my position fixed without relying on instruments that might fog, flood, or lie. At bolt 40, roughly 240 feet into the tunnel, my light hit something. The tunnel was blocked. A mass filled the bore from wall to wall, pressed against what I assumed was the intake grate behind it. In my light cone it was pale and dense, the surface textured and uneven, packed tight against the concrete. My first reading was root systems, fallen timber compacts against grates during high water, and the root balls carry soil, vegetation, other rubble. You get matted blockages that look almost like tissue from a distance. "I've got the blockage," I reported. Large organic mass fills the full tunnel diameter, pressed against the grate, consistent with compacted vegetation, possibly root systems. Kyle acknowledged. Ward's voice came on next. He'd patched himself into the comms channel from the control room. "Approach and describe the material in detail. Composition, density, and condition." I pulled myself forward. The mass grew in my light, its surface resolving into shapes I was still trying to read as vegetable matter. I reached it and put my gloved hands on it. The surface yielded like tissue. Resistance. Give. Then deeper resistance underneath, dense and waterlogged, with rigid structures inside it. I pressed harder and found something long and straight, like a rod, wrapped in fibrous matter that shifted when I pushed. I worked my fingers into a gap between two compressed sections and pried them apart. My light penetrated about 3 inches into the opening. I saw skin. Pale, swollen with water absorption, hairless. A joint, wrist or ankle, but the proportions were wrong, the bones too long for the circumference. Tendons were visible beneath the nearly translucent tissue, and there were more of them than any wrist should carry. I widened the gap, and my light caught metal. A surgical staple, then a row of them, holding a long incision closed along what might have been a forearm. Below that, an orthopedic rod, titanium by the look of it, ran through something that resembled a femur stretched half again its proper length. Around the rod, the tissue had overgrown itself in pale braided sheets, as if grafts meant to close one wound had kept closing everything they touched. Skin had knitted to skin. Muscle had adhered to muscle. The mass was compressed, but it had also been trying blindly and continuously to repair the damage of being pressed together. I released my grip and the gap sealed over itself. "Dale?" Kyle's voice. "Your breathing rate just changed. Talk to me." I put my hands back on the mass and worked laterally, moving along its surface. More of the same. Tissue over bone over hardware. I found a section where several bodies, or what had been bodies, were compressed together so tightly that the skin had grown across the contact points, bridging from one form to the next. Limbs tangled through one another. Arms from one form threaded between the ribs of another. I counted arms in a single section and reached 7 before I lost track of which body they belonged to. Some of the hands had extra fingers. Some of the arms had joints in impossible places. "I need a minute," I said. "Take it," Kyle said. "I'm right here." Ward said nothing. He was waiting. I gave my report carefully, choosing words the way a man chooses steps on rotten planking. Organic material. Human in fundamental structure but extensively modified. Surgical hardware throughout. Orthopedic rods, staples, plating. Multiple specimens compressed and fused together into a single mass, abnormal limb count and skeletal proportions, dozens of individual forms, possibly more. Ward's questions came back sharper, aimed at inventory. Can you estimate the number of discrete forms in the mass? Not visually. Too much fusion and compression. What types of surgical modification do you observe beyond orthopedic hardware? Skeletal extension, possible respiratory alteration, limb duplication, extensive graft overgrowth. I can't give you clean categories from here. Do you observe movement, gas exchange, or tissue response? I was floating in a concrete tube at 160 feet, my hands on a wall of fused human remains, and the federal liaison was asking me whether any of it was still functioning. What exactly am I supposed to be looking for? I asked him. Describe what you see, Ward said. We'll assess from here. The movement was small enough that I almost dismissed it. A shift in the surface of the mass, maybe a foot to my right and slightly above my sight line. Settling, compressed tissue adjusting under the constant low current. I'd been pushing and pulling at the blockage for several minutes, and disturbed material resettles. That's physics. Then a hand extended from the surface. It came out the way a limb pushes through packed earth, slow and effortful, the fingers spreading as they cleared the surrounding tissue. 6 fingers. 5 in the standard arrangement, and a 6th growing from the outer edge of the palm, shorter than the others but fully formed, with an additional knuckle joint. The hand opened and swept through the water, reaching in a wide arc. It was reaching toward my exhaust bubbles. My regulator vented exhaled air through a valve on the right side of my helmet. Every breath I released sent a stream of warm, oxygen-rich gas upward along the tunnel ceiling. The hand tracked that stream, following the turbulence in the water, moving toward the source with the slow accuracy of something that could not see, but could feel the current my breathing made. I have movement in the mass. My voice was controlled because training makes it controlled. Training does not give you a framework for a 6-fingered hand reaching for your air in a tunnel at 160 feet. One of the specimens is active. A single hand extending from the mass. It appears to be tracking my exhaust output. More movement came before Kyle could respond, and I stopped talking to watch. A second limb, bare and pale, with surgical scarring along the bicep, pushed free from a different section of the mass about 3 feet below the first hand. Then a third emerged on my left, closer to the floor of the tunnel. The mass was waking up. Faces pushed toward the surface from inside the compressed tissue. Features built on a human template had been modified past it. Jawlines widened by implants seated beneath the skin. Brow ridges thickened and restructured. Eyes open, filmed over with cloudy membranes, moved behind the haze, tracking my light. Mouths opened and closed against the water in a rhythm I recognized after a moment. Breathing. Trying to breathe. The movement of a mouth that remembers air. On the necks and upper torsos of the forms nearest the surface, where the tissue was thin enough for my light to reach, I could see slits in the flesh. Gill structures, or attempts at them. The cuts were raw, the surrounding tissue swollen and laboring in weak contractions. Whatever these structures were supposed to do, they were barely maintaining some threshold of life. The organisms in the mass were suspended between dying and finishing the job, and they had been suspended there for what looked like weeks. I was already backing away when the first grip found my umbilical. The hand closed around the reinforced hose about 2 feet behind my helmet connection and locked down. I felt it as a sudden yank that pulled me forward and off the guide rail, straight toward the mass. I caught the rail with my free hand and braced my boots against the tunnel wall, fighting the pull, my weight against its grip. The hose was Kevlar-reinforced rubber, built to resist abrasion and sustained pressure, and the hand was crushing inward through the reinforcement layer. I could see the impression of each finger sinking into the material. Tendons stood through translucent skin like bundled wire. The muscle tissue in that arm was grotesquely overdeveloped, bunched and striated in a way that didn't look grown. It looked constructed. engineered for exactly this kind of sustained grip. I grabbed the hand with both gloves and tried to pry the fingers back. Nothing moved. The strength differential wasn't close. I could feel the structure of the hand through my gloves, the bones denser than they should be, the tendons taut as rigging. Nothing I could do with my hands was going to break that hold. While I fought the first grip, a second arm reached for my helmet. This one came from lower in the mass, extending from a torso fused into two other torsos at the ribcage. The three bodies shared a conjoined skeletal structure, held together by surgical steel plates bolted through the bone. I could see the plate edges where the tissue had retracted. The arms stretched for the exhaust valve on my helmet, and found it. Fingers closed around the valve housing, and I felt the subject pull its own weight toward my head. It wasn't trying to tear the valve loose. It was trying to bring its face to the escaping gas, to get its mouth against the stream of warm, used air bubbling from the vent. "Primary stimulus confirmed," Ward said. That was when I knew. I got the pneumatic cutter off my tool belt. It was a small, purpose-built unit. Pneumatic-driven blade, about 4 inches of cutting edge, standard kit for underwater rebar and rubble demolition. I positioned it against the hand on my umbilical, above the third and fourth fingers, and fired. The blade sheared through 2 of the 6 fingers. They separated, the cut tissue trailing dark fluid into the water that my light turned brown. The remaining grip broke under the loss of purchase, and I ripped the hose free. I kicked backward off the mass and swung the cutter at the arm, gripping my helmet. The blade caught it across the wrist, bit into modified bone, and the fingers opened. The arm retracted into the mass. Something struck my primary light. A limb or a piece of the mass dislodged by the struggle. The light housing cracked, and the beam died. The tunnel dropped to the output of my backup unit, a weaker lamp mounted on the chest of my harness. Visibility halved. The water went from dark brown to near black, the backup beam carving a narrow wedge that showed me the tunnel walls and little beyond them. I grabbed the guide rail and hauled backward, away from the mass. Hand over hand, fast, without counting bolts. 10 feet, 20, 30. I stopped and turned the chest lamp toward the blockage. The subjects that had moved were settling back. The hands remained extended, drifting in the current, fingers open and directionless. The faces had turned away from my light. They were embedded, fused into the wall of tissue and bone and surgical steel that held them against the grate. They could extend limbs through the surrounding material. They could grip whatever came within range. They could not separate. They could not follow. 30 feet of black water between me and them would have to be enough. "Kyle." My voice was rough in the helmet. "Kyle, the blockage is biological. Modified human specimens. Dozens of them, fused together against the grate. Some of them are still active. They grabbed me. I need extraction. Now." Kyle came back immediately, his voice dropping into the register he uses when things go wrong, and protocol is the only thing keeping someone breathing. "Copy. Initiating retrieval sequence. Are you injured?" "Negative. Get me out." Ward's voice cut in on the encrypted channel. "Can you confirm the number of active specimens?" "I am requesting immediate extraction." "Extraction procedures are being coordinated," Ward said. "Can you confirm that the active specimens responded to your air supply as the primary stimulus?" The question landed once as sound and again as meaning. It pulled the job into shape around me. The day rate, the direct call, the NDA, the welded hatch, the blank upstream map, Ward's questions about tissue response. 22 days offline, and nobody had sent a diver until now. Until they found one with the right experience, the right clearance history, and the right reason to need the money. I was here to confirm the blockage. I had never been here to clear it. "You knew what was down here," I said. Ward's channel was quiet for a moment. Then, "The situation is classified under the terms you agreed to this afternoon. Extraction is being coordinated. Remain at your current position and await further instruction." Kyle's voice broke through on the primary comms channel. He couldn't hear Ward's side of the exchange. Ward was patched into a separate encrypted feed that ran only to my helmet. Kyle was working blind, seeing my vitals spike on his monitoring board and hearing my half of a conversation he had no context for. "Dale, talk to me. Your heart rate is at 140. What's happening down there?" "Start pulling umbilical," I said. "Get me out, right now." "Pulling," Kyle said. I felt the umbilical tighten behind me as the surface winch engaged, reeling in the slack. I gripped the guide rail and started hauling myself toward the shaft, hand over hand, matching the retrieval rate. Ward's channel cut to silence, the flat silence of a severed connection. Somewhere above me, on the surface I couldn't reach, something was happening that James Ward did not want me to hear. I pulled faster. The tunnel stretched ahead of me, 200 feet of black water and concrete between me and the shaft, and behind me the mass waited against the grate with its arms out, its ruined mouths working against the dark. The vibration reached me through the concrete before the sound did. A low tremor traveled through the tunnel walls and into the water, picked up by my suit and my bones before my ears registered anything. I knew what it was. 18 years of dam work, and that particular frequency, the start-up shudder of turbine bearings beginning to spin, was as recognizable to me as a phone ringing in an empty house. The current changed. The slow background pull toward the grate began to strengthen. The acceleration was gradual, but the draw shifted from suggestion to demand. "Kyle!" I kept hauling toward the shaft, hand over hand on the guide rail. "Kyle, what's happening with the turbines?" His answer came back clipped. "The control board just activated. Turbine startup sequence is running. I didn't initiate it." "Who did?" "Ward. He's at an override console in the control room. I'm going up there now." The current was building. I could feel it in the drag on my umbilical, the hose catching the flow like a sail and pulling backward toward the grate. Kyle's winch was still reeling, but the tension in the line was climbing. I was 200 feet from the shaft. At 18 years in this career, I understood exactly what happened inside an intake tunnel when the turbines reached operating speed. The tunnel was a pipe. The turbines were a pump. When they spun up, everything in the pipe moved toward the blades. At full output, the current would rip me off the guide rail and drag me backward through whatever was left of the mass, through the grate, and into the turbine gallery beyond. Kyle's voice came back fragmented. He was moving, calling over distance. I heard him reach the control room, heard him confronting Ward. The words broke apart in transmission, but the meaning carried. "Why are the turbines starting with a diver in the water? Shut them down. Shut them down now." Then Loomis. His voice was quieter, but it came through because he was closer to a microphone and because what he was saying had the weight of something he'd carried for 12 years without speaking. He told Kyle that the turbine override was hardwired. It ran on a separate electrical circuit and bypassed every safety interlock in the dam. Once Washington authorized a purge cycle, and Loomis used those exact words, purge cycle, the dam's operators could not interfere. The system was designed so that the people who ran the dam could never prevent the turbines from doing what the turbines were built to do. Kyle's voice went ragged. "There is a man in the water." Silence from Ward's side. What the comms carried next was the sound of Kyle moving fast towards something, a crash that could have been furniture or a body hitting a console, and then other voices I hadn't heard before. Men who had been on site the entire time, and whom I'd never been introduced to, because I was never supposed to need to know they were there. The comms channel dissolved into interference and went dead. I was alone in the tunnel. The current pulled harder. My umbilical stretched behind me into the dark, the hose bowing in the flow, and its drag was becoming the primary force acting on my body. Every foot of hose between me and the shaft was catching current, and the winch motor on the surface couldn't overcome it. I pulled forward on the guide rail with everything I had and barely held position. I ran the math. 200 feet to the shaft, current increasing every minute, umbilical drag growing with the current. At this rate, the drag would exceed my grip strength within 4 or 5 minutes, and the hose would drag me backward off the rail regardless of what I did with my hands. I unclipped the pneumatic cutter from my thigh and put the blade against the umbilical hose, 18 inches behind my helmet connection. Cutting my own air supply occupied about 2 seconds while the current answered every objection I could have raised. The hose was killing me. 570 feet of reinforced rubber catching flow, enough drag to feed me to the turbines whether I held the rail or not. I fired the cutter. The blade went through the reinforced hose in one stroke. The severed end whipped backward in the current and disappeared into the dark. Air pressure in my helmet dropped to 0 for 1 heartbeat before I reached down and opened the valve on my bailout bottle, a small emergency cylinder mounted on my harness, the diver's last reserve. 12 minutes of air at a normal breathing rate, at my current exertion, closer to 8. The drag vanished. Without the hose acting as an anchor, I was just a man in a suit gripping a rail. And the current, while stronger than before, was something I could fight. I pulled. I made it 60 feet before the first piece of the mass came past me. A section of fused tissue, roughly the size of a torso, tumbled through my chest lamp's beam and was gone. The current was tearing the blockage apart. Behind me, the mass that had taken weeks to compress against the intake grate was being ripped from it chunk by chunk, the fused specimens breaking free and streaming down the tunnel toward the turbine gallery. More pieces followed. Limbs, sections of conjoined ribcage, fragments trailing surgical hardware that glinted once in my light before the current pulled them past. The tunnel had become a flume, carrying its cargo to the blades. The mass had clogged the grate because it had grown too much before it died. Too many bodies, too much graft tissue, too much engineered repair knitting separate failures into one obstruction the dam could not swallow. The purge cycle was tearing it small enough for the machinery. I kept pulling. 140 feet to the shaft. The guide rail bolts passed under my hands and I counted them without decision, the habit running deeper than conscious thought. Each bolt was 6 feet of progress. Each yard was distance between me and the grinding. At roughly 120 feet from the shaft, something dropped onto my back. It came from above, from the tunnel ceiling, where a junction bracket protruded from the concrete. One of the surviving subjects had been torn free from the mass but snagged on the bracket as the current swept it forward, and when I passed beneath it, the water pushed it down onto me. It hit my shoulders and locked on. 4 arms, 2 from each shoulder socket, the joints heavy with modified bone and overdeveloped muscle. All 4 closed around me at once, the upper pair gripping my helmet and chest, the lower pair wrapping my waist. The strength was immediate. I felt the hard-shell sections of my suit crack under the compression, stress fractures spreading through the composite plating as the grip tightened. It was smaller than I'd expected. The size of a teenager, maybe, if a teenager had been disassembled and rebuilt from the skeleton outward. Its body pressed against my back, and through the suit I could feel it working, the chest expanding and contracting against my shoulder blades, the modified respiratory structures laboring against the water. It held me the way a drowning person holds a rescuer, with everything, because holding on was the only imperative it had remaining. I was the only warm, fixed object in a tunnel full of moving water, and every modified muscle in its body was committed to that single fact. The upper arms were climbing, pulling along my torso toward my helmet, toward the exhaust valve, toward the bailout regulator. If it reached either one, it would block my exhaust and suffocate me with my own carbon dioxide, or it would crack the regulator housing trying to access the air inside. Either outcome ended with me dead in the tunnel, and the current would bring my body to the same destination as everything else. I braced my boots against the tunnel wall and got one hand free from the guide rail. The pneumatic cutter was still clipped to my thigh, the one tool I hadn't lost when I severed the umbilical. I pulled it loose with my left hand, while my right kept its grip on the rail, my arm shaking with the effort of holding both our weights against the current. The subject's upper right arm was inches from my faceplate, its fingers reaching for the exhaust valve housing. I positioned the blade against the arm just below the shoulder and fired. The blade sheared through modified bone and the dense, striated muscle surrounding it. The arm came free, and the current ripped it away. Dark fluid clouded the water around my helmet. The remaining upper arm gripped harder, compensating, its fingers finding the ridge of my faceplate seal and digging in. I repositioned the cutter and fired again. The second upper arm separated at the same point, and the pressure on my helmet and chest released. The lower arm still held my waist. The grip was deforming my suit's waist ring, the seal between upper and lower sections grinding against itself. But the subject's balance had shifted. Without the upper arms to anchor it to my torso, the current was trying to strip it off me. It was holding on with two arms against the full draw of the water. It swung around to my front. I saw its face, young, male, early 20s, if the bone structure underneath the modifications meant anything at all. The jaw and temples carried subcutaneous implants that distorted the proportions, widening the lower face, thickening the brow. But beneath those alterations was a young man's face. The eyes were open, clear. This one was present, aware. It looked at me through my faceplate, and the expression on its face was something I will carry for the rest of my working life, because I could not make it into anything other than what it was. Recognition. It recognized me as something alive in the water. Its mouth opened. I could see the modified tissue in the throat, the raw gill structures laboring at dissolved oxygen the way a shattered lung pulls at air, never enough. Its lips shaped a soundless reflex, the old motion of a body built for air, asking the world for something the world had stopped giving it. It had been drowning for weeks, and my regulator was 4 inches from its face, and I was the first source of breathable gas it had reached since whoever built it had flushed it into the river. I put the cutter against its lower right arm, just above the elbow, and fired. The arm severed. I moved to the remaining arm, the one keeping it from tumbling backward through the tunnel, through the grate, into the turbine blades that were spinning fast enough to vibrate the walls around us. For 1 second, it stopped trying to climb me. Its hand stayed locked around my waist ring, but the fight went out of the fingers. It looked from the cutter to my faceplate, and I understood the worst thing about that look. It knew enough to be afraid. It was looking at me when I fired the cutter. The arm separated. The current took the body. I watched it spin once in my chest lamp, truncated shoulders trailing dark fluid, the face turning away from me as the water pulled it into the blackness beyond my light. And then it was gone, moving fast, toward the blades. I fed it to the machine. The comms crackled. Kyle's voice came through, breaking through whatever barrier had been blocking the signal. Dale, can you hear me? I'm here. I made it to the lower gallery. That secondary cooling loop I marked earlier. There's a manual gate valve on the return side. I can't stop the turbines, but if I cycle this valve it should divert flow and reduce the intake draw. 60 seconds, maybe 90. I don't know how long before they find it. Do it. Get ready. 3 seconds of silence. Then the current dropped. The turbines were still running. I could feel the vibration in the walls, but the draw in the tunnel weakened enough that the force on my body halved. I grabbed the guide rail with both hands and hauled, arm over arm, faster than I'd moved since the dive started, boots scraping the tunnel walls for purchase. The shaft opening appeared in my light. The vertical bore, the transition elbow, the guide cable hanging from above. I reached it. I pulled myself around the concrete elbow and into the shaft just as the current surged back, Kyle's valve discovered and overridden by whoever was managing the federal systems on the surface. But the shaft's vertical orientation shielded me from the worst of the horizontal draw. The current tugged at my legs below the transition, but couldn't haul me backward around the bend. I hung in the shaft and looked up. 160 feet of vertical concrete between me and air. My bailout gauge was deep in the red. 2 minutes remaining, maybe 3, and my breathing was not going to slow because I had just cut the arms off a living thing and watched the water carry it into a turbine. A safe ascent from this depth required decompression stops, pauses that let nitrogen dissolved into the blood and tissues off gas slowly through the lungs. Skipping those stops meant the nitrogen would come out of solution all at once as the ambient pressure dropped, forming bubbles in the bloodstream and spinal cord. Decompression sickness, the bends, nerve damage, paralysis, death if the bubbles lodged in the wrong place. I had enough air for a straight shot to the surface. I did not have enough air for stops. I dumped my weight belt, stripped the remains of my tool harness, opened the dry suit's buoyancy valve, and let the expanding air inside the suit carry me upward, 160 feet in under 2 minutes. I felt the pressure change in my ears, in my sinuses, in every joint from my knees to my knuckles. A wrongness spread through the tissues, a carbonation in the blood, the nitrogen doing exactly what 18 years of training had taught me it would do if I ever did exactly what I was doing now. I did it because the air was gone and the alternative was the dark. I broke the surface inside the shaft and grabbed the platform edge with both hands. My arms worked. My fingers closed around the steel. I pulled myself up and onto the concrete, rolling onto my back, and ripped the helmet off because the bailout bottle was empty, and the first breath I needed was the cold November air above the dam. It hit my lungs, and I coughed until I tasted copper. The sky above the shaft was black and full of stars. I lay on the platform and breathed, and while I breathed, the wrongness in my body sharpened into specifics, tingling in my right hand that was already becoming numbness. A fog at the edges of my vision that would not clear. The nitrogen was forming bubbles in my tissues, settling into nerve sheaths and joint capsules, and every minute without a recompression chamber was damage being written permanently into my body. The platform had changed. Kyle's dive station was overturned, the monitoring rack on its side, cables strewn across the concrete. 2 men in civilian clothes I'd never seen stood near the shaft hatch. They wore nylon jackets over body armor and kept their hands where I could see them, which meant the gesture was for me. They watched me pull myself off the ground and did not approach or speak. Ward came from the control building. He walked at a normal pace. He was composed the way a man is composed when the situation he's managing is proceeding within expected parameters, and the diver crawling out of the shaft with a cracked suit and nitrogen poisoning is a contingency that falls within the acceptable range of outcomes. "Where is Kyle?" My voice came out wrecked, and I did not care. "Mr. Mosher has been removed from the site. He's being transported to a federal facility for debriefing under the terms of his security agreement. He needs to be here." Ward didn't engage with that. He told me the following things in a tone that never varied. That the dive was a classified federal operation conducted under authorities I had agreed to when I signed the supplementary NDA. That my helmet camera footage had been transmitted to a federal server during the dive and would not be returned. That my after-action report would reflect a standard rubble clearance dive with ordinary findings. That a medical evacuation helicopter was en route and would arrive within 40 minutes. He delivered this the way a man reads the terms of a rental agreement. "I need medical attention now," I said. "My right arm is losing function. The helicopter is the nearest appropriate resource. It's en route." My vision was narrowing. The numbness in my right hand had spread past the wrist and was climbing the forearm. I knew what was happening inside my body. Nitrogen bubbles lodging against nerve sheaths, compressing tissue, killing function inch by inch. Every minute without a recompression chamber was permanent damage. Ward produced a tablet from his leather portfolio. On the screen was a document, a supplementary classification agreement with legal weight that made the morning's NDA look like a library card. He held it out to me. "This needs to be completed before the helicopter arrives." I looked at the tablet, then at Ward, then past him at the 2 men by the shaft hatch whose names I would never be given. Behind them, through the control room windows, the turbine indicators glowed green. The purge cycle was complete. Whatever remained of the mass, of the subjects, of the arms I'd cut, of the face that had watched me through my faceplate, was slurry in the discharge channel by now, washing into the river, dispersing downstream past Ridger and into tributaries that fed irrigation systems and municipal water supplies, and the Pacific Ocean. Loomis appeared from the side of the control building. He carried a wool blanket and a bottle of water. He wrapped the blanket around my shoulders without speaking and put the water in my left hand, because my right wasn't closing anymore. He stood next to me on the platform and looked at the reservoir and the dark tree line and the concrete face of the dam he'd operated for 12 years. Then, quietly, while Ward was 10 feet away speaking into a satellite phone, "The cycles used to be smaller. Whatever they do up there, they've been making more of them." That was everything. 12 years of knowledge, delivered in 2 sentences to the only other person on the dam who now carried the same weight. Then he walked back toward the control building, because his shift wasn't over and the turbines needed monitoring, and Hank Loomis was a man who did his job regardless of what his job was for. I signed Ward's document. I signed it because my arm was dying and I wanted the helicopter. I signed it because I was afraid of the men by the shaft hatch and of what Ward represented and of what happens to contract workers who breach federal classification orders. I signed it because I understood that fighting this would cost me everything I had left and change nothing. But I also signed it because of what I did in the tunnel. If I ever spoke, I would have to speak about the face, about how it looked at me, about how for 1 second before the cutter fired, it understood what I was about to do. I would have to speak about the sound the blade made going through modified bone, and how the arm came away cleanly, because the blade was sharp and the tissue, for all its modifications, was still flesh. I would have to explain that I survived by becoming useful to the machine. The helicopter arrived at 11 minutes past 6. Military markings, no unit designation. They put me on a stretcher and gave me oxygen and flew me to a facility I later learned was a military hospital outside Tacoma. The flight took 90 minutes. The medic monitored my vitals and did not ask questions about why a commercial diver had been pulled off a dam in the Cascades with type 2 decompression sickness and a suit that looked like something had tried to crush it from the outside. The damage was permanent. Reduced grip strength in my right hand, chronic pain that woke me at 3 in the morning, partial hearing loss in my left ear. Nerve degradation that no amount of physical therapy would reverse. My dive certification was revoked 6 weeks later, officially listed as a medical disqualification following a diving accident. The paperwork was clean. Federal paperwork is always clean. I was reassigned to a desk position at the Corps Sacramento field office. I reviewed levee inspection reports and processed environmental compliance forms, using my left hand for the computer mouse because my right couldn't manage the precision. The salary covered what the dive had been meant to cover. Tuition cleared, support cleared, bills cleared. I had sold the part of my body that knew how to work underwater, and the receipt was a personnel transfer. I tried calling Kyle 3 times over the following 2 months. The number was disconnected. Forwarding information and updated listings led nowhere. I did not try a 4th time. Looking for Kyle meant opening the door to everything behind Kyle. The tunnel, the mass, the face, the cutter, Ward, the document. I had sealed that door with my own signature. 6 months after the dive, a copy of the Pacific Northwest Civil Engineering Quarterly arrived at my desk with the rest of the office mail. Page 14 carried a brief item on Harland Dam. The facility had completed a structural modernization program and returned to full power generation ahead of schedule. The intake system had been upgraded with, and I am quoting the language exactly, enhanced filtration capacity. I held the page with my left hand because my right doesn't grip anymore, and I understood what enhanced filtration capacity meant. Wider grates, higher throughput. The next batch of failures from the upstream facility would pass through without clogging the tunnel. The sensors would stay quiet. The system would keep moving. The machine would handle it on its own. The system had learned from its only malfunction, and the malfunction was me.